Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Beatles Forever. It's been interesting to find out things we hadn't heard about and finding out things in more detail than we may have known about before. And this is doing it through the book Peter Brown, The Love You Make. And we're getting very close to the end of the book. I keep saying that, but this is really true. The next video will probably hit the end of the book. And it's been interesting to see things through his eyes, even though the other Beatles have said that they didn't like the book. But he had said at the beginning of his book that he had the permission from all of them, so I don't know what happened. So anyway, well, let's find out what's going on next in this world of Peter Brown. March 20th, only 8 days after Paul and Linda got married, John and Yoko got married. Her divorce from Tony Cox happened on February the 2nd. And John decided to go for a private small ceremony at a place where he could get married quickly. He saw that Paul's wedding had been a big media deal, and he didn't want that. Peter Brown found a place in Gibraltar. The ceremony took less than 10 minutes, and after that they went to the airport and left, so they were only on the ground for a few hours. For some reason, John wanted to have his honeymoon in a public spectacle, so John took up the anti-war banner, and those who knew John felt that Yoko was influencing him. They went to Amsterdam for the honeymoon and checked into a £100-a-day luxury suite at the Amsterdam Hilton Hotel. They began their bed-in. Journalists and photographers from newspapers all over the world were invited to see them in bed. Some were expecting to see them doing sexual acts. I don't know why they thought that, but instead it was John and Yoko sitting up in bed in clean pajamas and holding flowers, and they spoke of peace. They were eating food from room service, and they only left the bed to get room service. They welcomed the press and day and night to give interviews and pose for pictures. John was reading the newspaper when he saw that Dick James, the Beatles' longtime music publisher, was selling all of his 37% of Northern Song stock to Sir Lou Grade at ATV. Grade wanted to gain control of the Northern Songs by buying up any remaining stock he could find. The stock came to £19.5 million. And John and Paul were shocked. They weren't even asked if they wanted to buy it from themselves. Dick James saw what Allan Klein was all about, and he wanted to get out. I can't say I blame him. Before he had done the deal, Paul and John had refused to sign an extension of their songwriting contract with Northern Songs. So Dick James doubted their longevity in the relationship, and when he ever wanted to visit the studio, he was asked to leave. He might have stayed on if Allan Klein hadn't gotten into the mix. John and Yoko were in Amsterdam. Paul and Linda were in East Hampton, New York on their honeymoon, and Klein was on vacation in Puerto Rico. That only left George to go see Dick James to ask him to postpone the sale until John and Paul could return to London. Neil and Derek went with them on this delicate mission. They weren't in Dick's office but a few minutes when things got heated. James said he had no intention of waiting for John to get out of his bed. He had to move his shares quickly or the price might fall. George jumped up and started to scream, "It's effing serious to John and Paul is what it is." Everyone stormed out of the office, and James said, "You're getting a lot of very bad advice, if I may say so." Allan Klein was to lead this financial battle. Paul and John had the wedge put between them in order to raise money for the counteroffer. John and Paul would have to put up their shares of Northern Songs as collateral. Even Klein was chipping in by putting up 145,000 shares of his MGM stock. The Eastmans advised Paul not to put up his stock. The Eastmans said it was too risky, and another reason became clearer on April 20th. Paul had 751,000 shares of Northern Songs versus John's 644,000. Peter had been purchasing shares secretly for Paul in his name. Paul said it was a matter of investing in something you believed instead of supermarkets and furniture stores, so I invested in myself. John got angry and said, "You've been buying up stock behind our backs." Paul blushed and shrugged limply. "Oops, sorry," he smiled. John said, "This is effing low. This is the first time we've gone behind each other's backs." It was wondered if John and Paul had gained control of Northern Songs, who would sit on the board, Allan Klein? The way he was acting, nobody would want to be a stockholder with him. So in the end, John made a statement that had the consortium going into ATV's hands. He said, "I'm not going to be effed around by men in suits sitting on their fat arses in the city." He didn't want to work for a company where he had no say. So John and Paul ended up losing their child. ATV appointed Dick James to sit on the board of directors. John and Paul were left with a 5,000-pound bill for Ansbacher and Company services. Now Klein was going to try and renegotiate the Beatles' contract with EMI and Capitol and get a huge advance. He was famous for that. The thing was, he didn't legally represent them. Klein had been representing them without a legal contract, and none of the Beatles had put their signature on it. The terms were for a 3-year period, and it could be canceled by either side at the end of each year. Klein's fee for managing them wasn't to be the standard 20% of their income, but 20% of whatever increases he made for them, so this was going to be a large source of income for Klein. Paul had the Eastmans, and he wasn't going to sign a contract with Klein. Paul was hoping that the other Beatles would see Klein's evil ways before it was too late, but no matter what happened, the other Beatles didn't want to sign up with the Eastmans. One night in May, all 4 Beatles were in the Abbey Road studios, and Klein appeared with a set of management contracts under his arm. Klein gave Paul a contract and said, "I have to have this thing signed." And Paul said, "On a Friday night, give me the contracts on Monday," and everyone started to groan that he was stalling. Paul said, "What was the hurry?" And Klein said he was on his way to the airport to catch a plane for New York, and there was an ABKCO board meeting over the weekend. ABKCO was Klein's personal company. Paul said he couldn't sign any contracts without showing them to his London lawyer, and who was Claire's Corman. Klein said, "This can't wait." He said, "If you don't sign them, we do the majority rules." Klein was trying to turn John, George, and Ringo against Paul. Paul said, "Forget it. You'll never get Ringo." And Ringo told Paul that he was with them. And Paul said, "It's like a bloody Julius Caesar. I've been stabbed in the bloody back. So it's come to this." Paul, though, wasn't getting much sympathy from the other Beatles, especially after what he'd done regarding Northern songs. So Klein flew to New York without Paul's signature. Peter said he was with Neil when he got a call from John, and he was with George and Ringo, and they were telling Peter and Neil to sign Klein's contracts in their capacity as directors of Apple Corporation. When it was time to renegotiate the contracts with EMI and Capitol, Sir Joe wasn't happy about paying the Beatles more money. But since the Beatles had fulfilled their minimum number of albums and singles, Sir Joe thought it was only right that they got an increase for additional product. And one day in May, Allen with the Beatles came to Sir Joe's office. Klein told Joe that they were to get everything and he was getting nothing. Sir Joe thought the man was joking, but Klein became more threatening and crass. Sir Joe asked Klein to leave, and he went with John, Yoko, George, and Ringo behind them, and Paul stayed back and made apologetic faces to him. Sir Joe said to his assistant, "That's all right, they'll be back." Half an hour later, Klein called back to apologize, and negotiations later resumed. The deal wasn't completed until September. The Beatles were impressed. Under the new terms of the 2 new albums that were due each year until 1976, all the new albums, they would get 58-cent royalty until 1972 and a 72-cent royalty until 1976. Before that, they were getting 39-cent royalty per LP. The reissues of early recordings would get a 50-cent royalty until 1972 and 72 cents after that. Klein agreed to reissues. That was a marketing ploy that Brian swore that he would never do. Paul was impressed as the rest of the Beatles were. He never complained about making money. He told Allen, "If you're screwing us, I can't see how." The Eastmans still weren't going to let Paul sign the new recording contracts that Klein had negotiated. They were worried that if Paul did that, then that could be legally interpreted that Klein represented Paul, and then he would be entitled, that is, Klein would be entitled to the 20% of Paul's increased earnings. So Paul was photographed with the Beatles, and it looked like he had signed the contracts with Klein, but he hadn't. Klein, once he got in power, did more than anyone anticipated he would. He first had a mass firing. Paul backed him up on that one. Paul, for once, had wanted to get rid of dead wood. Brian Lewis in the contracts department was the first to be let go. The publishing office was closed down, and Dennis O'Dell of the film division resigned. Magic Alex returned to London to find himself locked out of his Boston Place laboratory, and his precious inventions were sold to an electronics scrap dealer. Klein figured that Alex had cost the company $160,000, aside from the $20,000 paid for the Boston Place property. All his patents had been turned down as not being an invention, but an embellishment of an already patented idea. Peter had to do some dirty work. He did it because he thought he could soften the blow with kindness and dignity, which Klein wouldn't have been able to do. 6 employees and their staffs went in one afternoon, and Ron Cass was also let go. Cass had been doing a great job with the record company, and Cass felt that Klein wanted to live in the luxurious townhome that Cass was in at the moment. Apple had been picking up the tab, and Klein was looking for a nice place to stay. Peter, though, signed over the lease to Ron Cass, and Klein never forgave Peter for that. Alistair Taylor was also let go. He had been with Brian when he saw the Beatles in the Cavern Club. He was a loyal friend and supporter and the most frugal employee. Peter said when he told him, he choked back tears. Alistair tried to call Paul or John to hear it from them directly, but neither of them would take his calls. Alistair never heard or saw from any of them again. Klein's number one man, Peter Howard, moved into 3 Savile Road and took over financial expenditures. The waiting room was cleared of all eccentrics and loonies, and the employees were now asked to sign in and out on time cards. Jack Oliver was named the head of Apple Records, and Peter Asher resigned his position and took James Taylor with him. During this time, John Lennon changed his name from John Winston Lennon to John Ono Lennon, and he and Yoko formed their own company, Bag Productions, and took over Ron Cass's office on the ground floor. They turned the shining white room into a mess of magazines, newspapers, memorabilia, gifts from fans, spilled coffee, and ashtrays full of cigarette butts. John and Yoko were going to join George, Ringo, and Maureen on the Queen Elizabeth II to go to America, and when they got to Southampton Pier, they were with Derek Taylor, their personal assistant Anthony Fawcett, and a 2-man crew to record all their activities, along with 20 pieces of luggage. But John was refused a temporary visa to the U.S. because of his 1969 drug conviction. John thought that it was a simple thing and that Allan could clear things up. John and Yoko instead decided to take a plane to Freeport in the Bahamas. It was $1,200 overweight charge on that. They chose the Bahamas because they were part of the British Commonwealth and John couldn't be refused. Also, the Bahamas was close to the U.S., so they could have access to the American media. Well, it was a good thought, but it didn't really pan out because the media didn't want to come up with the airfare money to see John Lennon and his wife sitting on beds. The beds at the hotel only had rooms with twin beds, and they were cemented to the floor with a 3-foot gap between them. Sitting in a bed on a beautiful sunny day was perverse even for John and Yoko, so 2 days later they made their way to Toronto. When they got to Toronto airport, John was detained by immigration officials for almost 4 hours before he was allowed to enter the country on a provisional visa. Klein made a last-ditch effort to get John into the United States. In the meantime, John moved on to Montreal for a 10-day bed in the Queen Elizabeth Hotel. John and Yoko, at this time, moved into their home, the first real home, Tittenhurst Park. It was a £150,000 estate. It was on 74 acres with wooded hills and gardens. It had its own lake and over 50 varieties of exotic trees and flora. Before they moved in, a massive renovation had been taking place. A modern kitchen and a soundproof professional recording studio were being built. All business areas of the house were painted and carpeted in black, and all the living areas were in white. John and Yoko had a small island with a gazebo on it, built in the middle of the lake, where they would have somewhere to row on a sunny summer afternoon, and they could eat a picnic lunch. Well, that sounded nice. But they didn't really do that much over the summer, picnicking-wise, that is. They seemed to have vanished. They were back to heroin. Yoko said it was a car accident that caused them to take it, and she had back pain. They went into the master bedroom and never came out. They took their meals on trays in the room. The only messages going out were to the cook, their assistant, or Yoko's friend Dan Richer, who was living at Tittenhurst in one of the guest bedrooms. Paul managed to get John out with his enthusiasm. He wanted the Beatles to do a new album called Abbey Road. Paul somehow got everyone together for one last hurrah. Yoko, she was back with everyone too. She was pregnant again and in delicate health, and John didn't want to be away from her, so they moved to bed in the studio where she napped or read or knitted while John worked with Paul. In August at Tittenhurst, John and Yoko decided to get off heroin before they got more addicted. They didn't want to do it in a hospital. They decided to do it cold turkey. But Magic Alex, Ray Connolly, and Neil Aspinall remember it differently. They remember going to see John and Yoko at the London clinic, where they both were undergoing treatment for heroin withdrawal. And another episode happened when John and Yoko decided to go to the Toronto Rock and Roll Festival in Canada. John had such a good time, he decided he wanted to leave the Beatles and start a band with Eric Clapton and Klaus. Allen had been riding back with them on a plane ride back to London. He tried to dissuade John. Klein asked John to wait until the contracts were finalized before he started talking about disbanding the Beatles. John wanted to talk to Paul, and Paul had wanted to talk about the projects for the Beatles, but John kept saying, "No, I don't want to do that," or "I'm not interested." They began to argue, and Paul said, "We're still Beatles, aren't we?" And John said, "I ain't no Beatle." And Paul said, "Of course you are." And John said, "I'm not. Don't you understand? It's over. Over. I want a divorce just like the divorce I got from Cynthia. Can't you get it through your bloody head?" And the meeting ended with John rushing down the stairs and Yoko right behind him shouting, "It's over. Finished." Paul somehow believed that John would eventually calm down and there would always be the Beatles. I'm going to stop the video here. Allan Klein was acting like a bulldozer representing the three Beatles and trying to make business deals where he would get a piece of the pie. In the meantime, John was traveling around with Yoko, sitting in beds in various locations, getting attention from the press and pushing for peace. Yoko was part of the reason for John's sudden activism. Paul got the band together to create Abbey Road, and thank heavens he was able to do it. It's such a great album, and without Paul's enthusiasm, things would have been ended probably after the White Album. John and Yoko got off heroin, and then John decided he wanted to leave the Beatles just as he had left Cynthia to start over with a new band. In the next video, we will be concluding the book, The Love You Make. It has been quite a ride, and even though we all know how it ends, it's going to be interesting to see the end through Peter's viewpoint. I hope everybody enjoyed the video, and if you did, if you could give it a thumbs up, that would be greatly appreciated. I wish everyone a good day, and be sure to tune in again for another episode of the Beatles Forever. Thank you. Bye.